The Star of David. According to legend, the Star of David was on the shield of King David, a wise and heroic king of Israel in ancient times. Hitler decided that all Jewish people had to wear yellow cloth stars the size of a grown-up's hand. He did this to single them out. In the middle of the patch was the word Jude, which meant Jew. It was written in letters that looked like Hebrew letters. Although it was meant to be a badge of shame, many Jews wore their patch proudly. In 1948, soon after World War II ended, the new state of Israel was born. It was created as a homeland for all Jews. The Star of David appears on the flag of Israel. Chapter 6. Kitty. The day Anne turned 13, in June of 1942, one important person was not there. Oma had died that winter. Anne said that her birthday didn't mean much without her granny, but in the Frank family, there was always a lovely birthday party. This year, Anne invited boys and girls. Her mother baked a wonderful cake, and her father screened a movie about a brave dog named Rin Tin Tin. This was the last real birthday party the Franks ever gave. Anne received many presents from her family: books, a jigsaw puzzle, a pin, candy. But there was one gift she treasured most of all. It was a small notebook with a red and green checked cover that locked. On the inside cover, Anne placed a photograph of herself. Next to it she wrote, "Gorgeous, isn't it?" Anne named her diary Kitty, after an old friend with that name. 2 days after her birthday, Anne made the first entry in her new diary. Every entry started, "Dear Kitty." Anne told Kitty everything. All about a boy she liked named Hello, quarrels she had with her friends, books she had enjoyed, everything. Kitty was a friend who never argued and always listened. Less than a month later, there was terrible news to tell Kitty. On a Sunday afternoon in early July 1942, a notice arrived in the mail. Margot was to be sent to a labor camp in Germany. She was ordered to show up at the train station with her belongings and enough food for a 3-day trip. The Nazis had started rounding up groups of Jews for labor camps, hundreds a day. Edith had thought that Otto might be arrested, but never her daughter. Margot was only 16. The Germans had promised not to split up families. No matter what, Otto and Edith were not letting their daughter be taken away. The only answer was to do what many other Jews were doing. The whole family had to disappear as soon as possible. The next morning, at the very latest. What Anne and her sister didn't know was that their father had already found a hideout. It was attached to the building where his company offices were. There was a secret stairway leading to a group of rooms. For several months, Otto and Edith had been getting the hideout ready. Every night, they moved in pieces of furniture, dishes, silverware, bedding. They were careful to bring just a few things at a time. A bathroom with a toilet was built. There was also a stove in the hideout. What the Franks were doing was not unusual. In 1942 and 1943, between 20 and 30,000 Jews in the Netherlands went into hiding. That night, Margot and Anne packed their school bags with a few personal belongings. Anne put in curlers, hankies, books, a comb, and a few letters. The girls were not told where they were going. Anne could not say goodbye to any of her friends. Otto left a note in the apartment with an address in Switzerland scribbled on it. He wanted people to think the Franks had fled the Netherlands. The next morning, the girls put on several layers of clothes under their raincoats. It was too dangerous to carry a suitcase. The family closed the door of the home they had lived in for 8 years. Anne barely had time to hug her beloved black cat. Anne was sure she would be back home soon. She knew the neighbors would care for little Morchie. Still, her eyes welled with tears. There was one thing Anne made sure to keep with her. It was in her school bag, her plaid cloth-covered diary. Here is what Anne wore. 2 sweaters, 3 pairs of pants, a dress on top of that, a skirt, a jacket, summer shorts, 2 pairs of socks, lace-up shoes, a cap, and a scarf. Chapter 7. The Secret Annex. What was it like to live in the hideout, or the secret annex as it was called? First of all, the hideout was small. Although on 2 floors, the entire space was only 50 square yards. Behind the secret door were 2 rooms, one with a stove and sink, and the bathroom. A floor above had 2 more narrow little rooms, one for Edith and Otto, the other for Margot and Anne. Luckily, Anne's postcards and movie star photos were waiting for her. Her father had brought the postcards beforehand. So, Anne pasted up as many as she could on the bare walls to make her room more cheerful. Food supplies were stored in the attic, which had 2 small windows. From one window, Anne could see a tall clock tower. From the other was a view of a large chestnut tree. The attic became the place where Anne would often go to be alone and think. One of the very first things Anne and her father did was sew rough curtains over the windows. They could not risk people outside noticing them. During the day, everyone in the annex had to walk barefoot and whisper. No one could use the toilet or turn on a faucet from 9 in the morning to 7 at night. People working in the office building might hear them. Anne said everyone was as quiet as baby mice. Trash was burned in the stove. It had to be done after dark because smoke coming out of the chimney might attract notice. It was a cramped space with just the Franks in it. Then, a week later, another family joined them. They were friends of the Franks, Mr. and Mrs. Van Pels, and their only child, 15-year-old Peter. Peter had brought his cat, Mushy. 5 months later, one more person joined the group, a man named Fritz Pfeiffer. Anne thought he was stuffy and boring. Nevertheless, Anne ended up having to share her room with Mr. Pfeiffer, while Margot moved in with her parents. Miep was going to be the Franks' main link to the outside world. She was one of the 4 helpers. Besides Miep, there was another young woman from the Pectin Company named Bep, and the 2 men who now ran Otto's business. Their names were Victor and Johannes. The helpers were putting their own lives at risk, but they would do whatever possible for their friends. Miep usually came first thing in the morning while the offices were still empty. She got the day's shopping list from Anne's mother or from Mrs. Van Pels. At lunchtime, she or one of the other helpers would return with the groceries. Miep brought books, newspapers, and news of the outside world. Anne was most eager to hear about her friends. Even though 8 people were together all the time, it was lonely in the annex. Anne and her sister had never been very close. Margot was their mother's pet. Margot was pretty and intelligent and perfect. Next to her sister, Anne felt she always came out second best. But she and Peter Van Pels became good friends. Anne was very happy to have Peter's company. She later developed a crush on him and wrote to Kitty when Peter kissed her for the very first time. She wrote, "I am not alone anymore. He loves me. I love him." During the day, Anne and Margot and Peter spent a lot of time reading their school books. Otto Frank helped with their lessons. There was history, literature, foreign languages, geography, and math. Anne still hated math, but she wanted to keep up with her class. So did Margot and Peter. They hoped to return to school very shortly. Later on, they taught themselves shorthand, which is a type of speed writing. With so many people packed into the secret annex, quarrels broke out. It surprised Anne that the grown-ups argued so much. Of course, sometimes the arguments were about Anne. Peter's parents thought Anne was spoiled. So did Mr. Pfeiffer. Edith Frank argued with her younger daughter more than ever. But even if they were boiling mad at one another, nobody could yell or make a scene. It was too dangerous. At night, sometimes everyone in the annex went downstairs to the empty offices. It wasn't the same as going outdoors, but still, Anne could peek out the window and catch sight of people walking on the street. It was at night, however, that she sometimes felt saddest. She would think about all the things she had lost: her friends, her cat, the feel of sunlight on her skin, the smell of grass and flowers. Anne would pour out her troubles in her diary. She also started writing stories about life in the annex, stories about her childhood, and even fairy tales that she made up. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months. Winter came. Anne had been living in the secret annex for 6 months. Now it was dark out by 4:30 every afternoon. No lights could be turned on. They might attract attention. To pass the time, Anne and the others told riddles or talked about books they'd read. They even tried to exercise in the dark. The boredom was terrible, but being bored was not as bad as the fear of being found. One day, there was a knock on the door to the secret annex. Was it Nazi soldiers? Was everyone going to be arrested? No. Thank goodness it was only one of their helpers. He told them that a carpenter was at work nearby in the offices and not to worry. Another time, Peter dropped an enormous 50-pound sack of beans. The sack opened, and beans, and more beans clattered everywhere. Anne thought it was funny. She was up to her ankles in beans. But making any kind of racket was very risky. At night, the loud sound of airplanes could be heard. Anne knew that the airplanes were Allied planes. They were on their way to bomb towns in Germany. The tide of war had turned against Hitler. Anne's hope was that Germany would surrender, soon. Still, the noise of the planes frightened her. She would run to her father for comfort. He was the only person in the family who never scolded her. He was always ready to comfort her. By spring of 1943, food was scarce in the Netherlands. It became harder and harder for Miep and the other helpers to bring supplies to the annex. A year had come and gone. Every page in Anne's diary was filled, but Miep brought more paper so Anne could continue to write to Kitty. What Anne spent time writing about changed. She had become more serious. Her thoughts were often on the war. What is the use of the war? Why can't people live peacefully together? She asked Kitty. Anne herself was changing. She was turning into a young woman. On a wall in her parents' room were little marks that recorded the girl's heights. Anne had grown more than 5 inches. Her clothes were much too small for her. Her mind had grown too. She was no longer a noisy child. Another good thing was that Anne didn't fight so often with her sister. They were becoming friends. Anne was also more understanding toward her mother. One night, Anne was listening to the radio. It was a Dutch broadcast from London. The man said that after the war, diaries and letters would be published. Anne's dream now was to see her diary turned into a book one day. A book that others would read. To Kitty, she wrote, "You've known for a long time that my greatest wish is to become a journalist someday, and later on, a famous writer. I want to publish a book entitled The Secret Annex after the war. Whether I shall succeed or not, I cannot say." A fan of the movies. Anne kept a large collection of postcards and photographs of movie stars. She loved the movies, and one of her favorite stars was a Hollywood actress named Deanna Durbin, famous for her roles in films about teenagers. Anne was also fascinated with royal families. She kept a postcard with a picture of Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret of England on her wall in the secret annex. Today, Princess Elizabeth is Queen Elizabeth II of England. Anne spent a lot of time on her photo collection and was always changing magazine clippings and postcards to keep things interesting. The last pictures she had on the wall are still there. Miep and Yen. More than anything, Anne wanted Miep and her husband Yen to sleep over one night. On their first anniversary, they did. Many years later, Miep wrote a book about the Franks. In it, she described what that night was like. Anne wanted the evening to be like a grand party. She had special menus. Each part of the meal had a fancy name. Miep said she and Yen were treated as if they were movie stars. That night, they were given Anne's room to sleep in. The secret annex was so small, Miep could hear even the smallest sounds. A slipper dropping, or someone coughing in bed. Miep came to the secret annex almost every day to see her friends. Yen had been there many times too. But lying there in the dark was different. Miep felt scared. Any little noise startled her. Was someone about to break into the secret annex? Suddenly, Miep began to understand what hiding was like. It was frightening. And Miep and Yen just did it for one night. Chapter 8. Caught. By the time Anne turned 15, the families had been in hiding for almost 2 years, more than 650 days. It was June 1944. The war was drawing to a close. Italy, once an ally of Germany, had surrendered. The Allied forces were freeing France. On a map pinned to a wall of the annex, Otto kept track of the Allies' progress. To Anne, it was as if friends were approaching. She began looking ahead to freedom. On July 15, 1944, she wrote, "I think it will all come right, that this cruelty too will end. In the meantime, I must uphold my ideals, for perhaps the time will come when I shall be able to carry them out." Then, on the morning of August 4th, 1944, Peter heard loud shouting from below, men's voices. With guns raised, Nazi police stormed the annex. After so long, after being so careful, they were caught. It was all over. Someone had betrayed the people in the secret annex. But who? To this day, no one knows. Certainly, it was not any of the helpers. After Anne and the others were let off, Miep sneaked into the annex. She wanted to get there before the Nazis returned to clear out everything. She found Anne's diary on the floor, pages scattered all over. Miep gathered them up, as well as the Frank family photo albums, and locked them in a desk drawer. She hoped that, after the war, she would be able to return everything to the family. As for the 8 people in the annex, all ended up in a concentration camp in Poland. Mr. Pfeiffer, Mr. Van Pels, Peter, and Otto were on the men's side. Anne, Margot, Edith, and Mrs. Van Pels went to the women's side. At the camp, most people were put to death right away. Life for those who weren't could hardly be called life at all. Survivors say it is impossible to describe how awful it was. Margot and Anne were now separated from both their mother and father. The girls struggled to survive, but both came down with a sickness called typhus. They died in March of 1945. In April, British soldiers arrived and freed everyone left alive in the camp. The war was over. Finally. But it was too late for Anne Frank. Two leaders. During World War II, Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and Franklin D. Roosevelt, President of the United States, not only were united against the Germans, but became close personal friends. Roosevelt was serving his 3rd term as president when the United States joined the Allied forces at the end of 1941. That helped turn the tide of the war. He and Churchill met secretly to coordinate the attacks against their common enemy. A victim of polio who was confined to a wheelchair, Franklin Roosevelt is considered one of the greatest of all presidents. Sadly, he died in April of 1945, only months before the war ended. Chapter 9. One Dream Comes True. Of the 8 people in the annex, only Otto Frank survived the war. He returned to Amsterdam, hoping for a family reunion. Instead, he learned that his wife and daughters were gone. All that was left was the diary and photographs that Miep had saved. Otto knew that Anne had kept a diary, but he had no idea how much she had written, or how beautiful her words were. Otto typed up many pages for his mother and friends to read. Everyone urged him to show Anne's diary to publishers. The world needed to hear from this remarkable young girl. In the summer of 1947, Anne's dream came true. Her diary became a book. She was a published author. First it was called The Secret Annex. Then later, the title changed to Anne Frank, The Diary of a Young Girl. Hitler had murdered 6 million Jews. That is a fact, a horrible fact, and yet it is almost impossible to understand. Reading about the life of one young girl who died because of Hitler is easier to understand. Anne's diary made a huge, terrible event personal. Here was a girl with hopes and dreams. All she wanted was a chance to live her life. In the years that followed, Anne's diary became world famous. It has been translated into more than 65 languages. Otto Frank was 91 when he died in 1980. He spent those long years keeping alive the memory of Anne and his family. He did a very good job. In 1960, the secret annex was opened to the public. Every year, nearly 1 million visitors come. The furniture is gone, but Anne's photos of movie stars are still on the wall. And visitors see where 8 people fought to hold on to their lives in the only way they could, by hiding. The last words in this book about Anne belong to Anne herself. In her diary, she wrote, "In spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart." Timeline of Anne Frank's life. (1929) Anne Frank is born on June 12th in Frankfurt am Main, Germany. 1933 Otto Frank moved to the Netherlands. 1934 Anne, Margot, and her mother moved to Amsterdam. 1941 Anne and Margot attend the Jewish school in Amsterdam. 1942 On June 12th, Anne receives a diary for her 13th birthday. On July 6th, the Frank family goes into hiding in the secret annex. 1944 In August, the residents of the secret annex are arrested and sent to concentration camps. 1945 Edith Frank dies on January 26th. Anne and Margot die from typhus in March. Otto Frank returns to Amsterdam on June 3rd. 1,500 copies of Anne's diary are published in Amsterdam. 1947 Anne's diary is translated into English. 1951 A play based on Anne Frank, The Diary of a Young Girl, opens on Broadway. 1960 The secret annex is open to the public. Timeline of the world. 1918 World War I ends. 1923 The Nazi Party has its first rally in Munich, Germany. 1927 The Jazz Singer, the first talking movie, opens. The New York stock market crashes, setting off the Great Depression. 1933. Hitler is appointed Chancellor of Germany. Jewish businesses are boycotted. The Gestapo, or the secret police, is formed. 1936. The Olympic Games are held in Berlin, Germany. Deanna Durbin stars in Three Smart Girls. 1937. Franklin D. Roosevelt begins his second term as U.S. President. 1939. Hitler invades Poland and World War II begins. 1941. The Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor and the U.S. enters World War II. 1943. Sophie Skoll of the White Rose is executed. 1945. Hitler kills himself inside a secret bunker. Germany surrenders and World War II ends. 1952. Princess Elizabeth becomes Elizabeth II, Queen of England. 1956. Elvis Presley appears on The Ed Sullivan Show. 1960. John F. Kennedy is elected U.S. President. Bibliography. Frank, Anne. Anne Frank, The Diary of a Young Girl, Doubleday, New York, 1967. Gies, Miep, and Allison Leslie Gold. Anne Frank Remembered, The Story of Miep Gies, Who Helped to Hide the Frank Family. Sagebrush Education Resources, Minneapolis, 1988. Muller, Melissa. Anne Frank, The Biography. Henry Holt, New York, 1998. Poole, Josephine. Anne Frank. Alfred A. Kampf, New York, 2005. Pressler, Miriam. Anne Frank, A Hidden Life, Dutton, New York, 2000. Sawyer, Kem Knapp. Anne Frank, A Photographic Story of a Life, DK Publishing, Incorporated, New York, 2004. Van der Rohe, Ruud, and Rien Verhoeven. Anne Frank, Beyond the Diary, Viking, New York, 1993. Van Marsen, Jacqueline, A Friend Called Anne, Viking, New York, 2004. The website for the Anne Frank House is www.annefrank.org.